Well, on behalf of the Creative Writing Program, I'd like to thank the brave souls who stood up to wind and fire and probably other elements as well. Thank you for coming to this annual event. We're very proud of it and very proud of the program, and what you're going to hear tonight are 7 of us, faculty members and 2 recent graduates of the program, 1 in fiction and 1 in poetry. And we're going to begin with Sigrid Nunez, who also bravely comes up once a week in the first semester to teach a fiction workshop in revision of the short story. And she's been doing this for some years now. We'll be doing it next year, I'm very happy to say. In all that time, from numbers of students, I've heard nothing but praise for Sigrid. I'm reading one of her books now, a sort of memoir, but fiction, called A Feather on the Breath of God. It's a superb book, and in fact, Shufei teaches it. Is this better? Yes. So I was praising Sigrid's book, A Feather on the Breath of God, and I highly recommend it to all of you. It's a memoir, but also fiction, and it's actually taught in our workshops. So splendid is it. And here is, at long last, Sigrid Nunez.
Thank you. How does it sound? All right? It sounds very odd from up here. Yeah? All right, riding Amtrak, as I so often do, between New York and Boston, I got in the habit of writing some very short stories, so short, in fact, that I can read 3 of them in just a couple of minutes. The first one is called The Very Mean Student in Workshop. The very mean student in workshop says very mean things about his classmates' writing. It's not that what he says isn't true, it's that he says it as unkindly as possible. He is mean. He does not even try to find a way to soften his comments. He does not care about anyone's feelings. He's not interested in helping anyone become a better writer. He is just mean. Every class, it's the same. He always has a lot to say. He always has a lot of mean and deadly accurate things to say. Sometimes he will find 2 or 3 different ways to say the same old mean thing. The teacher is a young woman, a very nervous type of young woman without much experience teaching or writing. She does not know how to handle the very mean student. Nothing she tries seems to work. The teacher knows the other students hold this against her. They think she's to blame. At the end of the semester, they will write on their course evaluation forms, "Professor failed to control mean student. Professor allowed mean student to talk too much," like who was supposed to be teaching this class, professor or very mean student. Away from school, when she is working on her own writing, the teacher often feels the mean student reading over her shoulder. She seems to hear his voice, finding fault with every line. She imagines him rolling his eyes and saying things that are meaner than the meanest things he's ever said in class. Sometimes it's so bad that the teacher gives up. She rests her head on her desk and dreams of murder. One day, the mean student is sick and can't come to class. At the break, someone goes out and buys a box of donuts. Someone else comes back with a bottle of wine, a spontaneous celebration. But the next week, you know who is back, all better and as mean as ever. The teacher asks him to come to her office after class. Her office is tiny, and she feels anxious, stuck in that tight space with this mean young man who also happens to be rather burly. In class, he always sits by the window, which is at the other end of the room from where the teacher sits by the door. Now she feels trapped behind her desk with the burly student in the desk-side chair blocking her way to the door. He is so close that he'd just have to lean forward a little in order to touch her. The teacher starts to explain why she's asked to see him, but he just stares at her as if he has no idea what she's talking about. The teacher breaks off, the blood rushing to her face, and he leans forward and he kisses her. Now all the blood rushes away from her face, so it's a good thing she's sitting down. You are so mean is what she's trying to say, but can't because she's crying. Oh my God, I've hurt you. The student takes one of her icy hands between his own and starts chafing it. I'm sorry, he says. I'm so sorry. The teacher grows calm. She stops crying and thinks, how gentle he is for such a big man. And the next story is called Isabel and the Old Man. Like most people past 60, Isabel often thinks about growing old. At the same time, she often thinks back to a time when old age seemed a very distant thing, more like an option than a law of nature. After graduating from college, she had gone to live in a large city. In those days, rather than look for a husband or even a steady boyfriend, she was happy to date several different men. And given that she was attractive, fun-loving, and not terribly choosy, this goal was not hard to achieve. Of course, this playing the field wasn't going to last. It wasn't supposed to last. Remarkable, in fact, how fast it grew boring. And Isabel had imagined herself in due time settling down with the one. But long before this could happen, now and then when she happened to see a certain type of couple, an elderly woman accompanied by some geezer with rounded shoulders and sparse white flyaway hair, his belt riding high on his ribs, Isabel would feel a weird sort of ache for the old man she herself was going to end up with one far-off day. That man, as she saw him, though bereft of youth, would still have certain essential things. To begin with, thanks to a long and successful career, he'd have plenty of money to live on. He'd have a good heart, and in spite of the frailties of age, he'd have his dignity. It goes without saying he'd have all his marbles. He and Isabel would live a quiet but stimulating life together, a rich, elegant life as she saw it, going to concerts and plays and movies and traveling abroad, though never as part of any god-awful retirees group tour, please. Past the age of passion, they would still be romantic, as anyone who saw them, as Isabel did, against the backgrounds of those foreign cities and exotic landscapes could tell. As the years passed, the image of the old man began to appear more and more clearly to Isabel, almost as if he was walking towards her. But as more time passed, the image began, as if walking backwards, to recede. And now that she finds herself facing a different old age from the one she used to imagine, the question won't leave her alone. It plays in her head like something from an old song or a poem she was forced to memorize in school. Where is the old man? Oh, where is the kind, companionable old dear? Could someone please tell Isabel that? And the last story is called At a Banquet. When I got there, the banquet had just begun. The host was going around the table introducing each guest. This is Dr. Lewis. He made his fortune fleecing Medicaid. And that's Philippa Orson. Since her divorce, she's taught her Irish setter a few X-rated tricks. Old Haberfeld hasn't seen his mother since dumping her 5 years ago in a nursing home to which he lost the address. His wife Dinah there is an habitual shoplifter, and by the way, that BA from Harvard on her Vita is a myth. As of last count, Errol Horsky has watched Ilsa, she-wolf of the SS, 162 times. I looked wildly around the room. Behind the bar was a tall casement window, cranked wide open. I made a run for it, clearing the sill in the nick of time. That's how I ended up in this wheelchair, if you must know. But at least I escaped.
Thank you, Sigrid. Amtrak is very proud of you. We're very lucky to be in Boston because there are lots of schools here and lots of people teaching them. We're particularly lucky that Dan Chazen is nearby. He's taught for us last year. He's going to be teaching for us all of next year. Lucky students to have a teacher like this. He's been a superb teacher. And I think Bicentennial has just come out, right? Are you going to read from it? Good. I begged him to last year and he wouldn't. It's a wonderful poem, and now we're all going to be lucky because Dan Chazen is going to read from it.
Thanks, Leslie. Is this okay? Can you? Okay. Very hard to follow, Sigrid. I will read the title poem of this book. It's actually one that many of you have heard me read many times, so I'll try to do it differently. Hello? I'll do it in an accent. No. It's a kind of time machine, touching down at different places in my life, times. Bicentennial. 1. Moving as a mind moves across a math problem, or an eye across a lover's body, or a dragonfly across the sky, or a history through wars and bodies, or a film from frame to frame, or the moods, strangers to each other, or a ferry across the lake all day. Move with me now, for I need company. I have this wish to get caught up in something precisely unlike a poem, unlike writing for its straightforwardness, its power that is not the power of half secrecy, but is instead something enormous and potentially dangerous. And this is all I am afraid will move my mind 1 inch off the small white T where it sits and waits. My mind sits on its small white T and waits for something like what others experience when they avert a tragedy, but barely. And all of life is refocused in that moment, even the parts they hated yesterday, or worse than hated, felt merely a blank where emotion would be, a blank where meaning would be, if only they, too, could find the exact site in Paris by the Seine where the princess died, and see the spot, and remember the night she died, late in New York, in the era when my friends and I did copious amounts of ecstasy at parties, and when it hit you, you simply shone. Now, everyone in that room was beautiful, and in the mirror, your own face was a gift for which you owed even total strangers thanks. This was what led you in the first place to make the call, pool the money, and meet the guy in an alley off West 4th Street, returning to the bar or party with a handful of banana-colored pills, heads back, and away we go, though that night none of us expected to go exactly where we were going that night. I remember later in the Standards Bar, the weeping men who, by some accident of history and their bodies, it happened, cared for her the way you would a friend. And one man requested, "Oh, Lady, be good," at the bar. And the sad, slow song rang through the bar until I did feel, as the song kept telling me I did, like a lonesome babe in the wood, adrift upon some serotonin raft in a wide, slow stream 3 of time, late in the night of my childhood, before I had done anything yet I would regret. Now it was 1976, and my body in my bed felt for the first time what being part of a country feels like. A memory of flags and songs and foods I'd never had before, for it was the country's birthday. The country was having its birthday party in a park by the lake. What being part of a country felt like in the park, with the entire breakwater full of boats, with ferry boats blaring music offshore, everyone acting as though it made them happy to be part of the country. Even those I later learned were hippies, including my aunts and uncles, whose code seemed to include toward children kindness. What it felt like being part of a country was to be quite specifically targeted for love, as though a letter from a stranger had arrived, delivering the best, the most unexpected news. A neighbor put me up on his shoulders so I could see better the band concert, war veterans playing French horn, the neighbor who moved to Boston and became a caterer before he moved back home into his bedroom where his parents cared for him the year he died. He'd been my babysitter, the only boy who ever cared for me, and I remember his patience in watching me play, for he, too, seemed to have kindness as part of his code. And when he died, the neighbors gathered in the small front yard and planted a lilac, which whenever I visit home, I go and see. Did you know next door to our house there used to be a small stained glass chapel attached to a dormitory where the masses had a distinct folk flair and kindness radiated from the mousy students, almost as though it was part of their code? The girls from Rutland or St. Johnsbury or far away like Danbury, Connecticut, girls that now would be approaching 60, who sometimes cared for me upstairs in their tidy dorm rooms with crucifixes on a corkboard, coffee mugs, and toys they brought with them from home, which now they gave to me so I could play. And sometimes nuns in the convent, whose code, it appeared, included kindness, showed me the few things they brought, 5, from home to their small cell-like rooms. One, a young nun, was a coin collector, and she showed me a standing Liberty quarter engraved with the first initial of a boy she dated and who'd taken her to the fair. I had the distinct impression she still loved him, the way that whole afternoon led up to her getting the quarter from the drawer and putting it on the TV tray next to her bed, next to the rosary, and watched me react when she said the word boy. What does R stand for, sister? Richard, she said, and I wondered, since I was a coin collector too and knew the value of every coin, how much less it now is worth engraved. Now she puts the coin into the drawer and we move inside my mind to the Paris skyline, where an enormous Ferris wheel appears Lit by the light, it generates a wheel that spins and spins nowhere, nowhere, all night, whether we watch it or not. And children having their childhoods right now, this late in time, as though they had to stand in line, 6, just to be born, get on and ride. And from the top they see the sliver of history fate is allowing them to see before they disembark and scatter, some to joy, some to misery. And whether they live for 100 years or die as some have tomorrow, this is the childhood these children are having, which is something I remind my own children all the time. I say, you are having your childhood now. And they say, yes, Daddy. And I say, jokingly, but not really, how do you feel it is going? And they light up and they say, great, which is just what I would have said as a kid if someone, though who would it have been, had asked me this very same question. You are having your childhood now. Today you went to the bicentennial. Everyone in the world was there, and you were there. How does that feel? That's when I say, brightening, great, and wait until later, much later in life, as they must wait for the real answer. I'm having my childhood now. That's me. I'm at a party, 7, by the lake. The boats jostle for space inside the breakwater. A neighbor lifts me up to see the band concert. The French horns blare. The men wear their war uniforms. The hippies are riding history. The ferries are playing blues for the private parties. The mountains across the water, that's New York. I'm having my childhood right now in this country in 1976. That's me near the cannons that point to the Adirondacks. That's me clapping when the parade wends by. I'm in a park by the lake. This is the exact moment in time when I exist as a 5-year-old in this country, and everyone is there. At the bicentennial, there's the mayor and the Chamber of Commerce and the National Guard and the Rotarians, and there's my daddy, though he never knew me, my handsome daddy, happy, dancing the day away, my tall, handsome daddy and his brand new family, just starting out in life, elated at the thought they'd made it this far to this enormous party the country threw for itself, because who else would, 1 billion years ago today, on its birthday. Thank you.
See, you should always listen to me. Wonderful poem. Last year's fiction workshop was very special, and I think the most special person in it was our next reader, Nell Stevens. She came to us from England. When the year was up, she became, of course, a Global Fellow. And where did she decide to go? Paris, Rome, Lisbon, back to London? No. She went to the Falkland Islands, where it's as windy as there every day as it is here today. And where there, I believe there was only one other person, an old man, on the whole island. So she is pretty special, I guess. Now she's unhappily pursuing a PhD, which I warned her not to do, back in London. You'll hear for yourself now, this special student, Nell Stevens.
Thank you, Leslie. Is the sound okay? It's a real honor to be here, and thank you all for coming. I'm going to read from the novel I wrote on the island where I lived alone with only one old man. This comes from the beginning of the story when the protagonist, Ollie, has arrived to visit his uncle. and he's waiting to find out why he's been invited there. I want to say this is a true story, but I suppose I can say that many elements of this story are true. The storm passed, leaving behind an empty, washed-out sky and choppy sea. Snow melted in patches, revealing swampy expanses of moss between the white. Ollie looked out at the tilt of the land, waves frothing under cloud, and further off, the pale curve of the beach. A solitary penguin wriggled ashore on its stomach. It waddled purposefully towards the house, flashing orange on the underside of its wings as it worked them up and down. A moment later it stopped, turned and faced the ocean as though waiting for something to happen. Ollie opened the window a crack, letting in a gust of cold air and the sound of waves against the rocks. He tried to convince himself it was calming, the rhythmic crash, but instead his breath grew tighter and his thoughts fell into a pattern that echoed the din of the sea. Get me off this island, please, get me off this God-forsaken island. Whenever the house creaked, he spun around, expecting someone in the room. Each time he found himself confronted only by peeling wallpaper, a line of boots by the door, and the smell of unseen animals. Surely someone would come. His uncle would speak to him and explain why he'd been summoned there, or his aunt or his cousin, somebody. But time passed, the last of the snow melted, and nothing changed. To distract himself from his unease and an increasingly urgent need to piss, Ollie leafed through books stacked on top of the piano. They were Victorian agricultural manuals, Tibbitt's Practical Guide to Farming in the Colonies, To the West, Travel and Husbandry in the Americas, and The Gentleman Shepherd. To castrate the lamb, the gentleman shepherd takes his knife and cuts the top of the scrotum off, leaving testicles exposed. He squeezes them forth from the sack, grips them one at a time with his teeth, and bites them free. Ollie snapped the book shut. Outside, his uncle came into view, dragging a length of chain and leaning into the wind. Ollie scrambled towards the door and ran out into a blast of icy air laced with sea spray. It roared in his ears so loudly his own voice sounded faint when he yelled, "Grimshaw, Uncle Grimshaw, I need to speak to you." Grimshaw trudged on without looking back and vanished into one of the sheds. Ollie stood, out of breath, and then turned towards the toilet hut. The penguin was gone, though its footprints trod a visible path over the rippled mud. The wind had carved the ground, so its surface resembled waves, rising and sinking in small peaks and valleys. Ollie stumbled across it towards the hut, which was so close to the water, rusted and bent, it looked as though it were in the process of crawling from the sea. He reached it and tried to work the bolt back with numb fingers. When the lock finally came loose, the wind caught the door and slammed it into his face. Inside, despite the freezing air, the hut smelt of urine. As he fumbled with his fly, Ollie thought of Oxford, where it was summer, where Emma would be emerging in a haze of steam from the shower. She'd sit in her robe on the back step, smoking and flicking through the BBC News on her phone. Eventually, bored, she'd retreat to the bedroom and lie staring at the ceiling until she sank into her first nap of the day. She'd dream of what? Diseases, grateful patients, treatments for rashes, and wake later with a sense she'd achieved something. Emma, clean, satisfied, straightforward Emma. Ollie finished and buttoned his pants. The experience of missing her, of actually yearning for her, was so strange he was almost relieved to face the weather again. He left the hut and broke into a stumbling jog, focused on reaching the relative warmth of the house. He tripped on a rock concealed in ice and slid forwards, landing in mud. As he struggled to his feet, he noticed something in the ground a way off, white and round, half sunk in the earth. It looked like the remnants of a snowman. He stepped closer, an upturned mixing bowl, closer still, an egg the size of a person's head. He was standing over it, still panting from the fall before he realized it was a human skull, partially submerged. Its gaping black sockets stared eyeless out to sea. Teeth were just visible above the ground, crooked, biting mud. Ollie crouched, leaning as close as he dared to examine the cracked surface, stained with dirt and flecked with moss. His foot was pushing against something hard, and he realized with a start that a length of bone was protruding from beneath his boot. Glancing around, he saw more fragments, white and yellow, pushing upwards like plants from the peak. A way off, Grimshaw emerged from the outhouse, a shovel resting on his shoulder. Even from a distance, his frown was clear, heaving over his eyes. The temperature of the air seemed to drop further still, and Ollie felt oddly disconnected from his legs as he turned and ran towards the house. He thought he heard over the roar of the waves his uncle shouting, "Oliver, Oliver!" but didn't turn to look before scurrying through the door and forcing it shut. He stood panting and inhaled the smell of dust and old meat in the kitchen. Leaning against the door, he closed his eyes and saw the skull again, its sockets gaping as though astonished, the row of lipless teeth. It seemed suddenly, abundantly clear that his uncle was going to murder him. Despite the cold, he was sweating. His fingers tingled as he pressed them to his temples, trying to slow his thoughts. Soon the panic stilled and centered on one urgent desire, Emma. Emma, who was capable, sensible, practical. Emma, who had such a talent for ensuring her own well-being. He wanted her more passionately, more desperately then than he had in the entire 2 years of their relationship. He finally loved her the way she always told him to, the way that was impossible when she was actually around. The door shuddered against his back. He leapt forwards. It opened behind him to reveal his uncle, still clutching the shovel. Ollie reversed towards the parlour, tripping over a loose tile. He tried to breathe, but instead let out a peculiar, strangled squeak. "I see you met your Uncle Charles," said Grimshaw. Ollie managed to stutter. "Who?" Charles, your great-great-uncle Charles. He likes to surface in the boggy season. We have to cover him over again. Emma would know what to do." "Come, Oliver," said Grimshaw, gesturing with the shovel. "No need to be so womanly and hysterical and queer. We'll cover him over, and I'll tell you how the devil he ended up dead in the dirt."
A lot of laughs in the Falkland. So now I'd like to ask that handsome fellow there to come up and introduce a poet.
In the 6 years since Caitlin Doyle was in the MFA program at BU, Caitlin has published dozens of poems. She's been nominated a couple of times for the Pushcart Prize. It's not a surprise that all this has happened to anyone who knows her work from then or has known her work since. She was selected for one of the annual Best Poets, New Poets volumes by Kim Adenizio. To characterize her work, Caitlin sometimes signs her emails and her poems that she submits in class with the one-syllable Doyle. And there's a kind of chipperness, vulnerability, comedy, grace, and intensity that I associate with that terse, no particular gender signature that evokes the freedom and artfulness of Caitlin Doyle's poetry.
Thank
thank you for that introduction, Robert. And I also want to thank the creative writing department for inviting me to read here tonight. It's such an honor to be reading with Robert, Leslie, Dan, Sigrid, and Hajin. And when I was in high school, I entered a poetry contest, and I won, and it was one of my first forays into poetry. And at the time, part of the prize was a letter from the poet laureate, who was actually Robert Pinsky. And I remember how excited and encouraged I was to be reading words from Robert Pinsky about my poem. And I couldn't have imagined that I would go on to study with Robert and Rosanna Warren and Derek Walcott, and that I'd be standing here today. So I'm so grateful for the invitation. I'm going to read poems from my debut poetry collection, which I'm currently working on. And I'll start with a poem I wrote after having an apprenticeship to a Foley artist, which is a person who makes sound effects for film. The Foley Artist's Apprentice. I wanted to be one of his props, a thing that made the sound of other things, an umbrella pushed open and closed, birds' wings, a coconut shell, one half in each of his hands, galloping, galloping. I set up his microphone stands, and he made the crackle of fire with a ball of cellophane, poured salt on a tinfoil sheet for rain. The sound of skin on skin, two pieces of paper he slid against each other. I wanted to be the words on the paper. I wanted to be what I heard in the mixing studio as he layered and looped his tracks. I play them back. My body, the strip of steel, he shook for thunder. The feather he held to the spinning bike wheel for the hummingbird's hum. The fine-tooth comb on which he plucked the cricket song. The real sound isn't always the best, he said, when I asked, why not go outside and record the wind? And when I held the microphone to my chest, what it amplified was less like a heartbeat than the one he made when he wrapped the microphone in felt and gently tapped it against a bass drum again and again. The next poem I'll share is called Madame Tussaud, and I wrote this after visiting the Madame Tussaud Wax Museum, which if you've ever been there, you know it's a chain of museums that has wax figures on display, contemporary celebrities, people throughout history, and it's named after Marie Tussaud, who was a waxworks artist in the French Revolution. So when I went there, I noticed that there was actually a wax figure of Madame Tussaud in the corner, and I was struck by the fact that her figure was the least realistic looking, least convincing in the entire museum. Madame Tussaud. She made death masks of executed men, their severed heads more real in wax than flesh. Now wax herself, she stands inside her namesake museum as though wax is all she's ever been. Hands not her own arranged the specks on her nose and tied her lace-trimmed bonnet so that she looks like Mother Goose. The placard at her side reads Madame Tussaud, but something in her pose says otherwise. Says, pay no attention to me. Kate Moss is waiting in the room across the hall. Says, take your picture with Bruce Lee. Says, sit next to Madonna on the couch. She's left a space for you. Says, touch Brad Pitt, lean closer. You can almost hear his breath. Her pose says sorry for her face, not even alive enough to be a mask for death. The next poem I'll read, I wrote when I was thinking about the double meanings in the names Bush and Bin Laden. So George Bush and Bush as in plant, and also Osama bin Laden name, and then the idea of a bin laden with something, a container. And I was also thinking about W.H. Auden's quote about how proper names are poetry in the raw. So I was thinking about using those names as a way to approach political subject matter. In the bush. Here in the bush, who'd believe that? Here in the bush, we're looking right at weapons of mass, weapons of mass. In the bush, a bin laden with weapons of mass destruction. Not in the hills or holes in the ground, but in the bush we finally found weapons of mass, weapons of mass. In the bush, a bin laden with weapons of mass destruction. Not in a bunker heavily manned, but in the bush laden by hand, weapons of mass, weapons of mass. In the bush, a bin laden with weapons of mass destruction. Here in the bush, we stumbled upon it. Here in the bush, with skull and bones on it. A bin laden, in the bush a bin laden with weapons of mass destruction. The next poem I wrote is a poem addressing a girl who's just turned 13, and it's also exploring the number 13 in myth, tradition, history, the Bible. And there's a quote in it from the Bible, which I'll tell to you so you recognize it. 12 years they served Chedor Laomer, and the 13th they rebelled. 13. There are as many years in you as witches in a coven, devil's dozen, number of steps to the noose. No use to rub a rabbit's foot or knock on wood. You've had one too many birthdays than you should. 12 years they served Chedor Laomer, and the 13th they rebelled. So you learned to read from the book your father held before the fire, but the 13th psalm proved him a liar. And in your heart you said the multiplication tables must go higher. And then you began to bleed. Old dress filling with new need. There were 12 branches in your father's book, 12 kinds of precious stone. There were 12 loaves and 12 bright springs, but now there's a month no calendar brings. And now there's an hour no church bell rings. There were 12 gates and 12 golden cups and 12 fruits in the tree, 12 white pillars and 12 tall suns, but now there's a gate where no boy swings. There are as many years in you as petals on a black-eyed Sue, seats at the Last Supper, spades in a deck, no sense to hang a cross around your neck or throw salt over your shoulder. Your mother stiffens when you hold her. Your mother pulls away and you remain on the steps of the school. She won't come again until the fall begins to turn. It may be too late then for all but snow and nests below the leaves and trees whose shaking is uncontrollable. Give me back the child consolable. Taking you home may squeeze too hard. Taking you home may not say a word, but always audible. Give me back the child consolable. Always heard, your mother, invisible, as you turn and climb the steps, or learn that an eclipse is the moon across the sun, or discover that your age is divisible by none, or put your clothing on before the mirror. Never nearer, as you turn or discern a face ever clearer. What is happening? An opening? A loop of rope? A breach? A door? One step more, the hands can't catch, the hands can't reach. The clock is wound, but you're beyond. I'll now read a poem called Carnival, and I wrote this thinking about what can happen when you combine dark, complex subject matter with a sonic atmosphere that's steeped in the kind of sound echoes we associate with our early years, like lullabies, nursery rhymes, jump rope songs. Carnival. Pretty eyes, he said to you. Let's get tickets. Let's get two. Let's get on the tilt-a-whirl, then watch the house of mirrors swirl. Pretty lips, he said to me. Let's get tickets. Let's get three. Let's get on the zipper wheel, then watch the house of mirrors reel. Pretty here and pretty there, aren't we such a pretty pair? Pick a pretty, make a pass. Just be careful of the glass. Pretty that and pretty this, coming closer for a kiss. Now we're double, now we're half. And watch the house of mirrors laugh. I'm going to close with a poem that I wrote during a time when the news cycle was full of tidbits about the birther movement. So the birther movement, as you probably remember, was a movement asserting that Obama was born overseas. And at the time, McDonald's, the restaurant chain, was also coming under fire for importing meat from overseas. So, and apparently from China. So all of that was swirling around in my head and came together in this. Said Trump, Donald, to McDonald, Ronald, I'll sue if my quarter pounder with cheese came from a cow that was made overseas. Said McDonald, Ronald, to Trump, Donald, it's funny how your foreign policy abjures non-native cattle, but not migrant coiffures. Said Trump, Donald, to McDonald, Ronald, my hair's more American than the chief of state. Said McDonald, Ronald, to Trump, Donald, I saw made in China when it blew off your pate. Thank you.
I'm going to read from a novel, Crawling Along from Year to Year. We'll see if I ever finish it. This too, Mel, doesn't have the jolliest subject matter. Adolf Hitler killed himself on April 30th, 1945. First he poisoned his dog, then he shot himself as his wife of a day clomped down on a cyanide capsule. And that left Joseph Goebbels one more day to live. And in that day, he turns to his diaries, and he looks up one from a few years before, from December 1941, and he's thinking about a particular young actress that he'd been interested in. He was interested in a lot of actresses. This is a particular young one whose career he was helping. What had happened is that earlier that day, Hitler said, I want you to bring her over to the Chancellery for dinner. And so first we begin with a diary entry and then how Goebbels thinks about that. Fräulein Langa arrives by limousine. I walk with her through the chill night. She wears a woolen coat with a mink trim, trembling. I can smell beneath her perfumes the piquancy of her perspiration, as unique as a fingerprint. Is that why I'm trembling too? A strange phenomenon, dreamlike. As we approach the Reichskanzlei, our pace slows. I find it difficult to put one foot before the other. I experience the impression that each paving stone is the grave marker of a woman or a young girl who has taken this journey before. Little Mitzi, little Susie, Inga Lay, Mitford, the English woman, the poor Gelly, Renata, and then Eva, because Eva Braun, as you may know, tried to commit suicide before she actually did. I came to a stop. I see Linda step between the SS guards. He stood waiting beneath the outspread eagle's wings. I stand rooted. Why can't these women obey like Blondie? A joke from the Führer. But even Blondie, ever obedient, sacrificed herself. Yoo-hoo! The girl had seen Linga. She waved her free arm. She was not trembling from fear, but from excitement. She breaks for me. She runs to the steps. The guards hold out their arms in salute. Linga makes that special little bow of his. He leads her inside. That's the end of the diary. Now he's thinking about the rest of that night. She returned, Carolina, at dawn. She looked no different. When she took off her hat, every strand of hair was in place, and with her crowded teeth she managed her familiar smile. But there was a clown's spot of color on each of her cheeks, and she seemed to be able to talk without taking a single breath. Oh, what a time we had! Glorious, like a dream. We had dinner, just the two of us, by candlelight. There was a soup, a beet soup, and there was veal. Only the Führer, Wolf, that is what he asked me to call him, Wolf would have none because he thought it was cruel to raise animals only to kill them for our pleasure. But he did not mind as long as he could see that I was enjoying myself. And I was. Basically, especially when they were changing courses. All he had was spaghetti roll. Can you believe it? The leader of the Reich, of the whole world, and he's eating spaghetti. And when they took the plates, he clasped my hand in his and asked if I minded, as if that were possible. And he said it was a beautiful hand, and how happy he was that I was there with him. And then under the table, you know, I felt his foot press mine, and he gave such a shy smile, like a schoolboy, and it just melted my heart. And then there was a compote with pastry crust, so very delicious, and he told me that, let's see if I remember, that because of the rain, our army had for the longest time been bogged down in mud. Schlamm, schlamm. He kept repeating that word. But now, you see, a freeze had come, just as his scientists had predicted, so that the soldiers would soon move forward and take Moscow, just the way Napoleon had done. And did I know he had started our invasion on the same day in June that Napoleon had? And that if I wanted it, I could be, oh, Dr. Goebbels, well, I was just going to say the exact words he said. You could be my Josephine. I had not said a word. I could not. Oh, this is Goebbels speaking again. I had not said a word. I could not, had I so wished. But I was watching the double dots on her cheeks, which were now deeper, redder, larger, like those of a fever patient. I asked her, and when the meal was over, what meal? What are you talking about? Oh, our dinner with the candles. Well, you know, it seemed to me that he had made a kind of proposal. It was a proposal, wasn't it? That I could be the queen, no, the empress of the world. And I didn't know what to say. And he said, please do not be anxious, and that I should take my time and to think about what he had said, but that he had seen all my films. I think that must be thanks to you, Dr. Goebbels. I'm sure of it. And that was what made him fall in love with me. And was it possible that he might be a person that at some time I could love in return? And then I stood up to thank him for the lovely dinner. And then, of course, I would think carefully about what he had said. And then he said, and this was for some reason so heartbreaking, the way he said it, as if some mean grown-up person had taken away this bright and pale and charming little boy's treat. He said, oh, you aren't leaving? And I said, no, no. And he said that was good, because he wanted to show me what no one else got to see, which was a tour of his private quarters. And so we went from one beautiful room to another. Oh,
the flowers, the sweet-smelling flowers, and the paintings, and the tapestries, and the sculptures, and the busts. It was like a museum, and the carpets too. And then we came to a room that must have been his bedroom because of the bed in it, and his personal things. And I didn't want to go in. Well, half of me didn't want to go in, but he said, Wolf said, I want to show you something. And he took me by the hand up to where there was a statue of a woman, you know, a nude woman, up in a niche in the wall, with lights on it, a lovely woman, all in marble. And he said to me, Die umwegende schönen Karl. And I must have looked at Dunce, because he laughed and said, don't you remember one of your early films? I can't tell you how many times I have watched it, alone, at night, and that I was wearing a bathing costume in it. And as soon as he said that, I did remember how Herr Froelich made me run in and out of the water, that freezing water. I shivered just thinking about it. But the Führer, Wolf, was saying how I was wearing a two-piece suit and how it made him feel when he saw me in it. And, oh my, he had gone behind me and was my zipper. He was undoing my zipper. And he was saying that the statue was that of a goddess, of Minerva or Venus, I don't know. I couldn't hear him. My heart was beating. And he was saying something like he wondered how that young girl's body had developed. And was it as bountiful, that was the word he used, großzügig, as that of the Greek goddess. And would I, that was the voice of the little boy again, the shy little boy, would I allow him to discover in real life what he had seen only on the screen? And then the straps of my gown were down, and he was still behind me, and he asked if please would I step out of it, completely out of it, and how beautiful my legs were, and how we should have that cameraman punished for not doing me justice, for defaming me, and that because I was a goddess, he would like to remove my underthings. And when he took everything off my body, and he said, would I be so kind as to pose with my arms over my head, just the way Venus, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, was standing? And so I stood with my arms over my head for a minute, for 2 minutes, for even more minutes. And Wolfie said he knew it was hard, but that he could hold his arm out in the Hitlergruß for hours at a time. It was a strength he had, and that Göring could only do it for 10 minutes. But my arms were starting to ache, and when I dropped them and turned around, he was naked, but still shy, with his hands in front of him. And then he lay down, not on the bed, but on the floor, on the carpet that was on the floor. He was lying on his back, and oh, it was so touching when he said, do you love me just a bit? And his little man thing was eager and pink, like a boy's. So then I gave myself to him and let him do everything he wanted, and it was, of course, the happiest moment of my life. Goebbels says, listen to me, Fräulein. I've not slept this night. I have been up. I've been making arrangements. But she did not hear me. Her eyes were closed, and there were no more dots on her cheeks. Her whole face, her neck, her throat had turned red. Even the hair on her head, surely this was an hallucination, seemed about to burst into flames. I did not dare speak. I thought it would endanger her. The way it is said that it is fatal to make a person who is walking in his... It is fatal to wake a person who is walking in his sleep. A moment passed. Suddenly the color drained from her face. It was as if all the blood had been sucked from her body. She opened her eyes. She smiled. You are an expert, Herr Goebbels. I cannot fool you. You see what a terrible actress I am. Will you let me help you? Mein Gott, nothing can help me. I can put my ministry, all the resources of my ministry at your disposal. Do you love me? You don't love him. You catch him like an incurable disease. Just a bit. We will get you out of the country or hide you. You do not have to see him again.
She did not hear me. She was doubled over, clutching her bowels. She moaned. "Are you in pain?" I asked her. I could barely make out her words. The glass. That is what she said, and said again, Die Glasplatte, the pane of glass. "Fräulein," I began. Her head spun to the side as if she'd been slapped. Then she doubled over once more. "The filth," she muttered. "Auf die Oberlippe." "You must listen," I said. "The other women, even his bitch of a dog, all did away with themselves. You must do what I say." I believe she heard me. "First you will stand. Then you will turn and go out that door. There will be an automobile, a ministry automobile, waiting for you. The driver has your passport. He will take you to Tempelhof, where you will board a flight to Lisbon at 10:15 this morning. You will be met in Lisbon by a trusted member of my staff. He will escort you to a flat, a hidden flat. There, no one will find you. I do not think we will see each other again. Well, nothing is certain, perhaps after the war. My hope for you is that when you are in the air, above the clouds, you will look down on this stinking earth and recall that some things in it are lovely. The mountains, the rivers, the lakes. And that some people on its surface will, well, let's hope they will be able to help you forget. Now, will you stand? She stood. Good. Excellent. Now turn around. That is good too. But at the door she stopped, turned once more and started to speak. At that instant I thrust out my arm and said, quite sharply, Heil Hitler. Then, as ordered, she turned yet again and walked away. Thank you. I didn't know if I dare read that, but I did. And with my wife here, too. You may have seen in Saturday's New York Times the announcement that Ha Jin has just been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters. The Times said in its article that it is commonly believed that this is the highest honor in all our arts. With Ha Jin, it could not be more deserved. In exile in this country, with all the demands of his work for us, through personal pain at times, he has never stopped working at the highest level. Every year, or the longest, every other year, a new book, a wonderful book. So there's going to be another new one called A Map of Betrayal. I don't know, are you going to read from that? Yes. So you're going to hear Ha Jin, the new Academy member, read from his new novel.
Thank you. It'll be very hard to read after Leslie's fantastic reading the episode. Because this book, A Map of Betrayal, it's kind of, it's actually is a kind of an unusual book because it has 2 lines of narration. And I tried to blend history and the personal experiences together. But because there are 2 lines, so there is always a matter of pace and the density of details in each line of story. So it might sound quite odd. In fact, it's very hard. It was very hard for me to decide where to read because they are entangled. But at this point, this is in the year of 1958. The narrator, in fact, is a dark woman, a woman professor, history professor. But she has been constructing her father's story. So this line of the story is her father's story. Her father, by now, had been in the States for more than 3 years. He was ordered to marry an American woman so that he could put down his root in the States, working as an agent in the CIA, a translator. So he was a mole, basically. But he was ordered to be to remain in a low profile, so he could be more useful in the future. But by this time, the narrator was 1 year old. And Gary, the protagonist is Gary. His boss is an American officer, Thomas. Since he wasn't naturalized yet, Thomas could give him only less classified documents to translate, mainly the type listed as confidential. About that, there were other kinds, such as secret and top secret, and to the latter, Gary, as a non-citizen, was denied access. Regardless of that, every once in a while, Thomas would use Gary for rendering some instructions into Chinese. These were secret orders for the spies in China and must not allow any ambiguity and inaccuracy. Therefore, the principal linguist, that's his nickname, Gary's nickname. Therefore, the principal linguist was assigned the job. Through translating the directives, Gary came to know some agents' code names, their missions, their communication plans. He just kept notes of them and did not attempt to send out the intelligence right away, because he remembered the instructions from Bing Wen, that is his handler, a single handler based in Hong Kong. He was a strategic agent, not a petty spy specializing in sabotage or stealing technology. In addition, Tom is a determining factor in the espionage business. Generally speaking, the information before an event takes place is intelligence, whereas the information on an event that's already unfolding has become news. If the event is over, any information about it is nothing but archival material. Without a direct delivery channel, Gary couldn't pass urgent information to Bing Wen quickly, so he didn't make effort to collect the kind of intelligence whose value hinged on a time frame. At the same time, his mind had been preoccupied with the ongoing events in China. At the end of July 1958, Khrushchev visited Beijing, and the two countries signed a joint communique that highlighted the cooperation and solidarity between them. A month after the Soviet Union leader had returned to Moscow, Mao ordered a massive bombardment against the nationalist troops on Jinmen Island. One evening, 500 artillery pieces, cannons, howitzers, heavy coast guns fired all at once, shelling the military positions, wharves, airfields, supply lines. Within hours, hundreds of soldiers were killed outside the bunkers and in the trenches. 3 generals, all vice commanders of the Jinmen defense, were also among the casualties. The top brass were eating dinner in a dining hall when a barrage of shells landed on them. 2 generals were killed on the spot, and the other one died on arrival at the field hospital. For days, the nationalist army was too crippled to fight back, many of their artillery pieces destroyed. Then the United States gave them 12 8-inch M55 self-propelled guns, which were shipped ashore under cover of darkness. With the deployment of these heavy howitzers, the nationalist troops began to fight back and managed to suppress some of the communist artillery fire. Though one of the big guns was blown up by a hostile shell that landed right into its barrel. Soon, mainland China declared that it would bombard the island only on odd days to give the civilians and the defending troops a breather. Following the events after the attack, Gary came to know that John Dulles and Chiang Kai-shek had recently held a secret talk about how to deter Red China's aggression. The Secretary of State suggested using nuclear weapons, which Jiang agreed in principle, saying that a handful of small tactical bombs might do the job. But when Dulles revealed that the warheads should be at least as powerful as those dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Jiang was taken aback, aghast. After the talk, his government informed the White House that nuclear weapons should not be an option. The fallout might endanger Taiwan and the U.S. military bases in Eastern Asia. Another piece of information also took Gary by surprise. Some political analysts in Southeast Asia believed that the communist artillery attack mainly served two purposes. One was to sabotage Khrushchev's new policy for promoting world peace, because Mao, an advocate of confrontation, was always spoiling for a fight against the imperialist West. The other purpose was to form a link with Taiwan, preventing it from slipping away from the mainland. In other words, the bombardment signified a territorial claim. It was reported that the moment Chiang Kai-shek heard of the attack, he said in praise of Mao, "What a marvelous move." That was because he didn't want to see an independent Taiwan either, still viewing himself as the leader of whole China. Initially, Gary was baffled by Jiang's words. All the three killed generals were noted for their ability and bravery, and Jiang must have known them personally. Then how could he call the bombardment a marvelous move? Evidently, to the top commander, even generals were expendable like soldiers. The whole affair felt like as if Mao had stretched out his hand, which Jiang had shaken with appreciation, so that Jinmen Island could serve as a link between the mainland and Taiwan. The two sides seemed to have worked in tandem, and only the soldiers were losers. Gary took a photo of the documents, specifically the conversation between Dulles and Jiang. He wanted the Chinese leaders to be more cautious in the future when they decided on a military action again. They ought to take into account possible nuclear attacks on China. After telling Nellie, that's his American wife, after telling Nellie that he wanted to travel back to Hong Kong to see his cousin, Gary went there in early December, a good time of the year for taking vacation there. He gave thought to the possibility of being noticed and followed by the U.S. counterintelligence. Let them, he said to himself. If that happens, I'll go home sooner. But nothing unusual happened, as McCarthyism had been publicly condemned and foreign travel was more common now. In Hong Kong, Gary handed the films to Bing Wen. For this intelligence, he was paid $1,000, deposited directly into his account at Hang Seng Bank. It was on this trip that Bing Wen revealed the existence of Gary's twins back home. It knocked the wind out of him, his stomach heaving. He was speechless, staring at a photo in which Yu Feng, that's his Chinese wife, the first wife, Yu Feng and their son and daughter were smiling at him. They all look content. His wife aged a little and fleshier than before, while the children both had his kind of eyes and mouth. The boy was bonier and shorter than the girl. If only they could have traded the bone structures so that he might grow up more striking. The photo must be recent because the twins look 7 or 8 years old. They have started school the previous fall, according to Bingwen. After examining the three faces in the grainy picture for a long while, Gary sighed and said, "If only I had known Yufeng was already a mother." Bingwen lifted his cup of woolen tea, his pinky sticking out, and took a sip. He asked, "Your point being?" "I would have had second thoughts about getting married abroad." Eyes glazed in pain and smitten with regret. Gary wanted to add, "What a terrible mess," but he held back. Furrows gathered on his broad forehead, while his ears were buzzing. He swallowed, wheezing and biting down a wad of misery in his windpipe. Unconsciously, he lifted his cup, but the tea splashed, leaving brown drops on the white tablecloth. He put it down without drinking it. "I see," Yingwen said. "You want to be more devoted to Yufeng and to your kids. That's why our high-ups did not allow me to disclose the truth to you. They feared you might want to come back soon. Our party and country need you to stay in the enemy's camp. They ordered you to keep me in the dark? Yes, my friend." Gary turned speechless and realized he might have to live in the United States for a long time. In spite of his bitterness, all he could do at this point was to ask his handler to take care of his wife and children back home. Bingwen promised, "Rest assured, their well-being is guaranteed in the hands of our country." He picked up a succulent shrimp ball with his red chopsticks, dipped it into the shati sauce, and put it into his mouth. Thank you.
Well, some of you I know are aware, but many of you may not be, of how remarkable the poetry program at BU has been for a good deal more than half a century. From Robert Lowell teaching at the Ritz Bar, and the many other wonderful poets associated with our program, Sylvia Plath and Sexton, George Starbuck, Derek Walcott, who of course taught here for many years, Louise Glick, who up until this last year was at the same lectern reading, the wonderful David Ferry, who often dropped by and taught for us. So I like to think of this span of years as from Robert to Robert, because Robert Pinsky has more than held up his end of that great tradition, and in many different ways. I probably, Robert, won't be introducing you in this particular venue anymore. It's possible, but I may not. So I just want to tell everybody that over these more than 20 years that Robert has been in the program, much of the wonderful things that have come about at BU Creative Writing, the innovative things, including the idea of this annual lecture, has been brought to us by Robert. So Robert, thank you for being such a wonderful colleague and such a wonderful poet.
Leslie stole my thunder. I wanted to come up here and make the first thing I say, which I will say, which is that I feel very fortunate for these 20 plus years at BU to have been part of this. I'm always proud of the colleagues in this reading And we owe it all to the imagination and patience and guidance of Leslie Epstein. I try to write about a lot of different kinds of things, personal and larger than personal. Somehow it always winds up, I realize in retrospect, one way or another, being about how endlessly tangled and mixed up and effective all the threads that go into every large and small thing are. That the history of things always seems to come into it. And I'm going to concede that or demonstrate that by reading 3 poems to you, one a recent, rather new poem, one an extremely old poem that I'd kind of forgotten existed till I was reminded about it, and then I'll end with another old poem. The recent poem is called Running with Noodles. Running with noodles. Tomato, imported from Mexico, was once thought poisonous until a parson disproved that misconception by eating a tomato in church. But that tale itself is misleading. Another legend like Washington destroying a cherry tree. Tomato, cousin of deadly nightshade. Non-toxic, exotic. Columbus brought Italy the pomodoro, as Marco Polo brought the noodle from Asia. In old American movies, they sometimes say tomato, meaning a woman, a word like cupcake, casual contempt that we know to hiss at today. Back then, my poor grandma used to call Italians noodles. In Yiddish, lakshin. Spaghetti with red sauce is Asian and Chinese, Aztec and Chinese. Spaghetti with red sauce, Aztec and Chinese. Noodles from the east, golden apples from the west. Creole inventions that time makes pure, tipico Italiano. So Nana could warn me in Yiddish about Joe Cittadino, Robbie, don't run with the Luxians. Doro, pomodoro. Doro must mean those first imports were yellow, and breeding made them red. Or maybe the name is just one more misapprehension. Only the Sibyl knows, who wrote the truth on a leaf lost in the wind. One of the students in the graduate writing seminar this year, who's interested in her own ethnicity and all the different, in a way, her children's ethnicity, which comes from 3 continents. And she dug up this poem of mine that I didn't put in my selected poems. And she said that it was important to her for that reason. We had a conversation about it. And this poem, I guess I wrote it, well, I know I wrote it about 35 years ago because the little girl in it is now an MD at Mass General. The poem is called The Song of Reasons. The Song of Reasons. Because of the change of key midway in Come Back to Sorrento, the little tune comes back higher, and everybody feels a sad smile beginning. Also customary is the forgotten reason why the Dukes of Lévis-et-Mirepoix are permitted to ride horseback into the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Their family is so old that they killed heretics in Languedoc 7 centuries ago. Yet those dukes are somehow Jewish, and therefore those dukes claim collateral descent from the family of the Virgin Mary. And the people in magazines and on television, they're made to look exactly the way they do for some reason, too. Every angle of their furniture, every nuance of their doors, and the shapes of their eyebrows and shirts has its history or its purpose, arcane as the remote Jewishness of those far dukes. In the great halfway crazy tune of the Song of Reasons, a child has learned to read, and each morning before leaving for school, she likes to be helped through the Question Man in the daily newspaper. The Question Man. Your most romantic moment? Your family hero? Your worst vacation? Your favorite ethnic group? And pictures of the 5 or 6 people next to their answers. She likes it. The exact forms of the ordinary each morning seem to show an indomitable charm for her, even the names and occupations. It's like a bedtime story in reverse. The unfabulous doorway of the day that she canters out into, as businesslike as a dog. She trots down the street, sunny pavement, plane trees, the flow of cars that come guided by with a throaty music like the animal shapes that sing at the gates of sleep. So there are those 2 poems, 3.5 decades apart, and today is the anniversary of a significant American event that happened 103 years ago today. The fire at the Shirtwaist Factory in New York that led to a lot of laws that were supposed to mean workplaces were safe. So I'll close by reading a poem in our annual pentameter, Shirt. And I would express again my gratitude to Leslie Epstein and to this wonderful writing program. Shirt. The back, the yoke, the yardage, lapped seams, the nearly invisible stitches along the collar turned in a sweatshop by Koreans or Malaysians gossiping over tea and noodles on their break, or talking money or politics, while one fitted this arm piece with its overseam to the band of cuff eye button at my wrist. The presser, the cutter, the wringer, the mangle, the needle, the union, the treadle, the bobbin, the code, the infamous blaze at the Triangle Factory in 1911. 146 died in the flames on the 9th floor. No hydrants, no fire escapes. The witness in the building across the street who watched how a young man helped a girl to step up to the windowsill, then held her out away from the masonry wall and let her drop. And then another, as if he were helping them up to enter a streetcar and not eternity. A third, before he dropped her, put her arms around his neck and kissed him. Then he held her into space and dropped her. Almost at once, he stepped to the sill himself. His jacket flared and fluttered up from his shirt as he came down, air filling up the legs of his gray trousers, like Hart Crane's Bedlamite, shrill shirt ballooning. Wonderful how the pattern matches perfectly across the placket and over the twin bar-tacked corners of both pockets, like a strict rhyme or a major chord. Prints, plaids, checks, houndstooth, tattersall, madras, the clan tartans invented by mill owners inspired by the hoax of Ashen to control their savage Scottish workers, tamed by a fabricated heraldry. McGregor, Bailey, McMartin. The kilt devised for workers to wear among the clattering looms. Weavers, carders, spinners, the loader, the docker, the navvy, the planter, the picker, the sorter sweating at her machine in a litter of cotton as slaves in calico head rags sweated in fields. George Herbert, your descendant is a black lady in South Carolina. Her name is Irma, and she inspected my shirt. Its color and fit and feel and its clean smell have satisfied both her and me. We have culled its cost and quality down to the buttons of simulated bone, the buttonholes, the sizing, the facing, the characters printed in black on neckband and tail, the shape, the label, the labor, the color, the shade, the shirt.
Well, bundle up. Don't let the wind blow you away. I hope we've blown you away. Thank you for coming.